All right, it's great to be back. I want to welcome everyone again to the Noahide class on Noahide laws. We're holding by animal issues, spoke about Rabbi Chaim, about treating animals properly, right? Not causing them to suffer. We spoke about that. And we're going to speak now. About crossbreeding. Animals grafting trees. So we spoke, as we said, we mentioned about causing pain to animals. So now this, I think actually, causing pain to animals probably comes up quite a bit, especially if people have pets, what to do if they're, if they're sick, do they have to do in heroics, other things. Here also, I guess if a person would be part of a, I don't know if they had, animals on their own or part of a zoo, he took animals and crossbred them or trees. I mean, people have trees. This comes up, people plant trees. Definitely can come up because you can have a lot of trees that are already crossbred. Right? In other words, you can have a tree that can have multiple things on it. You plant it, you got a problem. So the question is, can it, draw benefit from the fruit? Whatever, that's what we're going to speak about. So says in Tractate Sanhedrin 56b that the source, the Noahide mitzvah, is not to crossbreed animals or graft any trees, right? Specific types of trees, because the Gemara says, rabbis taught in the Brisa that 7 commandments given to the children of Noah: justice, not cursing divine name, not committing adultery, acts against sexual immorality, murder, against theft, live from a live animal. So Rabbi Chaim ben Gamla says also against eating blood. No eat blood taken from a live animal. Rav Chidka says also against sterilization. Right? But many rabbinic authorities reject that, whether sterilization is forbidden or not. That's also a whole discussion. Rabbi Shimon says against sorcery, right? Not playing with Ouija boards, bringing up souls, other things, which we spoke about in Derech Hashem, that's not that hard to do, to tap into the dark side. Right? Rabbi Yossi says Noahides also warned against every act stated in the section of sorcery, which is Deuteronomy, chapter 18, verse 12. Again, playing with spiritual forces. Here the issue is playing with creation. Even though if a person, let's say, would take a horse and a donkey, put them together, and make a mule. Now, God doesn't stop you from doing that, but it is interesting that a mule, tremendously strong animal, only one problem with the mule: sterile. Right? That's probably not a coincidence. That you do such a thing, you can't reproduce it. Right? So, that's one thing. Rabbi Lezer says, Noahides also warned against kilayim. What's kilayim? Forbidden mixtures of species. But they're permitted to wear clothing made from mixture of wool and flax. Jews say they're permitted to wear them, we're not. Jews are forbidden to wear a mixture of wool and flax, what we call shatnez. That means in the same piece of clothing. In other words, if you had a sweater, right? If you had a sweater that says 100% wool, so then the Jew would have to get a check, make sure there's no flax in it. But let's say the sweater might have flax in it, let's say, and you wore a coat on top of it that had wool, that wouldn't be a problem. It's only in the same piece of clothing. So that's one thing. And a plant kilayim, meaning to plant different plant species of vegetation in the same plot of land, right, also should be forbidden. However, sorry, that may be okay. But Noahides are prohibited from mating different species of animals, from grafting one species of trees onto another. Planting them, in the same plot, may be okay. Grafting them, is going to be forbidden. So I have to see why, what the difference, what the difference over here is. But this is interesting. I'll just mention one thing, and that is, you talk about, we talk about this, about planting things, together, or let's say better having a forbidden mixture, forbidden mixture of species, right? Plants, animals, whatever the case is. Now, normally we say the Noahide laws are laws that make sense according to the Torah. So you might ask, what's the problem? Why would that be forbidden? Why would that be forbidden? We'll have to see. We'll have to see what the, what the source, what the source is going to be. But if you would ask most people, they say, why is that universal? Why in the world is that universal over here? See, we don't say that by Jews because 80% of the Torah anyway for us doesn't make sense. Doesn't make logical sense. So we have to try and make sense out of it. Right? But for non-Jews, they'll say, come on, never heard of such a thing. Never heard of such a what? You can't cross-breed? What's the problem? Right? They have to see what the source is. But at face value, as being a universal idea, right? You're going to say, what's the universal idea? Why can't a person do that? So I want to say, you're playing with creation. Who says you're allowed to make new species? Doesn't matter if God doesn't stop you and you end up creating different things. You take a peach and a plum, you make a nectarine, right? So it's done. People do it. Not permitted. You have to derive benefit from the fruits. But you see, people do it. So what's the problem? So I made a new species. So that could be the issue. That exactly could be the issue. Who says we'll have to play with creation? So there's a discussion over here, right, about each of these ideas. About what the, about what it says. Right? Certainly, certainly, about what it says, and why. Because the whole thing, I would say, is, it's a big decree. Be a big decree over here. Why would I say such a thing? Well, what's the source? Let's say better. What's the source? Right? So here, the question's asked, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Right? Where do we know it from? Where do we know that Noahides may not crossbreed animals or graft different types of trees? It's Gemara's question. Where do I know it from? Comes along Shmuel, and he says, because the Torah tells me. I got a verse. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19. Torah says, by decrees you shall observe. Do not mate your animal with another kind. Should not plant your field with diverse species. And a garment of mixed species shall not come upon you. Do not mate your animal with another kind. You should not plant your fields with diverse species. Means just as your animal prohibits mating, your field prohibits grafting trees. Now, interesting over here. Right? It says it's a decree. It's a decree that you should do. In other words, not rational. It's a decree. Right? So Rashi here says, my decrees you shall observe. Now, when you say my decree, it's a little bit strange over here. Why? Because when the Torah says something and it's a decree, I don't have a whole introduction. I don't have a whole statement over here. God makes a decree. He says, shut up and do it. That's what he says. I mean, my language. Shut up and do it. That's what you got to do. No introduction. Right? So if we see such a preface, right, we see such an introduction, got to ask the question, what's it doing here? Right? What is the purpose? What's the purpose over here? So here, what are we talking about? We're implying that it's already known. Mankind already understands this. Right? In other words, what is God doing over here? God is doing this to preserve them. Right? In other words, you can have these commands. For non-Jews, we have similar language in other places. But doesn't necessarily mean they're obligated, right, so to speak. But what do we have over here? What do I have over here? That Shmuel explains these statutes, these laws, right, they go way back. They go back before Leviticus chapter 19. Right, because it says, don't mate your animal with another kind of animal. You're not going to plant in the field, etc. But what is Shmuel explaining? He's saying you're not going to plant in your field with diverse species. Meaning, what is diverse species? I can't take one and put on another. Grafting trees. That's what it means. It doesn't necessarily mean planting multiple species in a single field. That's what I might think. In other words, I got a big field. So let's say I plant a whole bunch of things in the field. Right? Maybe that's okay. Maybe that's not a problem over here. That should be, that should be okay. What we're saying is I can't plant one on top of the other. Right? It's seemingly to make it into a new species. Comes along Rashi in the Ritva in Kedushin 39a. Rashi in the Ritva say, just as two animal species cannot be joined by mating them together, so too I can't take two plant species. Same thing. I can't put them together. Now, what's the obvious question now? The obvious question is, what do you do with the other part of the verse? Right? The last part of the verse says about wearing mixtures. What does that have to do with anything? One thing to plant them together. Put them together. Right? What about wearing them? What does that have to do with anything? Right? It goes on the Yad Ramah, one of the early commentators, it says over there, my statutes. Why does it say my statutes? Because there are two prohibitions. What are the two prohibitions? One is cross-breeding animals. Can't take two animals, different species, put them together. And trees. Can't cross-graft. But not to the third prohibition of wearing kilayim, of wearing these garments made of wool and linen. Right? In other words, it applies to two, not the third one. So therefore, a Noahide can wear a garment made of wool and linen. Doesn't apply to them. The Jews were not allowed to. Right? So, if we had something, let's say, again, we had a suit. Person buys a suit, it's 100% wool. Got to get it checked. Make sure there's no linen in it. I remember one of the suitcases I lost when I went to South America, had my suits. So I had to go buy suits when I was there. So I go to a store and I have nowhere to, obviously nowhere to check where I was in South America, for shatnez over here. So I go into a store, I said, yeah, I'm looking for this, my broken Spanish. And I said, I want this sin lana without wool. Right? So what did I get? Polyester. Right? And, until I got to a normal place, and I could buy a suit and make sure it didn't have, shatnez in it. Right? But, until that point, that's what I wore. So anytime I put on these other clothes, my kids knew I was like working around the house or doing something. Right? Because that's the only time I wore them after that. Right? But again, for a non-Jew, not a problem. For a non-Jew, they're excluded over here. But a Jew cannot do that. Now, what's the reason? We don't know. It's a decree. Right? It's a decree over here. So, according to what Shmuel said, how he's learning what Rabbi Eliezer said, so the whole world is commanded against crossbreeding, cross-grafting trees. That command given to everybody, across the board. Because from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, it says, by decrees you shall observe. That means a prior mitzvah seemed to exist. Now, the question is where? Where would that be found? Where is the source for such a thing? An earlier source. What's the earlier source? Genesis chapter 1, verses 11 to 12. What does the Torah tell me? The Torah says, God said the earth shall sprout forth vegetation, right at the beginning of creation, herbage that produces seeds, edible trees produce fruit of their own species, and the earth produce vegetation, herbage that produces seed of its own species, trees that bear seeding fruit of their own species. Right now, what are we going to dissect over here? No pun intended. What does it say? Its own species. Right? Herbage of its own species. Only the trees to produce fruit, i.e., identical to their own species, not to other species, or not making new species. So therefore, Adam was given the commands with keeping animals separate, right? Different species separate as well. So therefore, I got an earlier source, right? And that makes sense. That makes sense according to what the Torah says. Because it says edible trees that produce fruit of their own species. What would I understand? Their own species, literally. You're not taking something to make it into a new species. That's what I would learn, right? So we learn from there. We learn from there that what? We have an earlier source. We have an earlier source. Comes on the Rambam. In the Rambam of the Laws of Kings, chapter 10, Mishnah, Halacha 6, includes these prohibitions, part of the Noahide laws. Says the Rambam, according to oral tradition, that's going to be a problem. Why does it say according to oral tradition? He very rarely says that. Meaning it's halacha Moshe Miskinai. Right? It's halacha given from God to Moses at Mount Sinai. Just was given over later. Or Moshe tells us about it later, whatever the case is. Noahides are forbidden to crossbreed animals, graft different species of trees together. The Rambam says clear. They're not allowed to crossbreed animals. They're not allowed to graft different species. But are they killed for it? No. They're not executed over here for violating this prohibition. Now, you're telling me, okay, that's pretty clear. Pretty straightforward. Right? But there's a problem. Right? The problem is, the Rambam says, according to oral tradition. Why? Why does the Rambam say, according to Rabbi Eliezer or Shmuel? That would have been the obvious thing to say. But he says according to oral tradition. So, seems that the Rambam is not using that as a source. It would seem that the Rambam over here is holding a different source. Now, when we look at this, we've got a few issues. First of all, if that's true, the Rambam does not hold of this source in Sanhedrin. Why does he not hold of it? First question. Second of all, where does he know? Where does he know such a law exists? If he doesn't hold of their derivation, of where it comes from. In other words, the source in the Talmud tells me where it comes from. Right? It comes from an earlier source. Very good. But if the Rambam doesn't hold of that, where does he get it from? Where does he get it from? Doesn't get out of thin air. Right? He can't just, God forbid, talk out of his elbow over here. Where do you get it from? So, there's a lot written on this. Tremendous amounts written over here. Right? Obviously, we're not going to go into all the details. Right? There's a lot of issues here. A lot of potential explanations. Some say that the Rambam rejects altogether any Noahide prohibition, right? Well, that's kind of hard to say in some ways because over here he says it is forbidden, right? The question is at what level, is it forbidden? Another thing you got to understand is also when you look at this piece of Talmud, Rabbi Eliezer is a lone opinion. Normally we go according to the majority, right? We don't normally go according to a lone opinion. There are cases, where rabbinic authorities will go according to a lone opinion if it makes more sense than what the majority say. But it's rare. It's extremely rare. It happens. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, but it's rare. So Rabbi Eliezer is a lone opinion. So if he's learning these prohibitions, he's telling me there's going to be a Torah prohibition, then what is it? Then if he's going to say it's a Torah prohibition, what would I understand? I got an eighth Noahide law. Normally we say there are only 7, right? There are only 7 over here, so what do you get an extra one? That would pin him against everybody, right? The majority of the sages hold him only 7. Comes along, Rabbi Eliezer says, nope, got another one. So therefore, the halacha cannot be like it. Cannot be like Rabbi Eliezer and Shmuel. That's one side. The other side is that unlike other opinions in the same piece of Talmud over here, let's say, against eating blood or sterilization, that's not rejected. That Talmud doesn't rejects this part. So then comes along the Rambam and he says, oh, Rabbi Eliezer and Shmuel, right? What's their opinion over here? Their opinion is a smachta. What's in the smachta? The word of smachta, the root is samach. Samach mem chaf, to rely on, to lean on. Right? And the smachta normally means the rabbis put a verse on it, but it's really rabbinic. It's really rabbinic. But why they put in a verse on it? To show its importance. Right? That it's not an actual source for the prohibition. Because since they're not explicitly commanded in the Torah, then maybe they're not independent Noahide laws. Right? But maybe they're subsumed within one of the larger categories. So maybe you tell me, okay, it's crucial, it's important, there's not actually a Torah source, but let's say it comes underneath a different category. So if it comes under a different category, different issue. Different issue over here. Now, what's the $1.5 million, $2 million question? That's going to be which category? If you're going to tell me it's a larger category, where is it? What is it? Comes along where Shmuel Bar Chofni Gaon, right, time of the Gaonim, right, time before Rashi. He explains these prohibitions come under the header of what? Aver Minachai. Not eating a limb from a live animal. Right? Comes underneath that. The Ram Mipano, another great commentary, says, no, it really comes under the category of sexual immorality. Right? Which we've spoken about. Right? It's immoral here. According to the Ram Mipano. Sorry, the Ramah Mipano. Right? Basically, you're taking species, putting them together, not allowed to be. Right? So a forbidden union comes under what category? Immorality. And you say, come on, animals are programmed DNA, you're right. But in general, different species of animals are not going to mate with different, with different species. They're going to mate with their own. Now, I'll just throw one thing out there. The Beis Levi, the father of Rav Chaim Brisker, born 250 years ago, or 300 years ago, right? In his commentary on the Torah, Parshas Noach, says, man sinned, why the animals deserve to be destroyed. Because the animals crossbred. That's impossible. Right? According to nature, it's impossible. An animal's going to mate with its own, not with another species in general. Right? So basically, Levi says, what happened over here? Because mankind had such influence. They even had influence over animals, things that they did, so animals copied. Now, there was such a thing years ago. right, many years ago, it was documented that there was a certain type of pelican, I think, if I remember correctly, certain type of pelican that the males themselves were trying to mate. Right? So that shouldn't happen. That goes against nature, totally against nature. Right? Of all places, where were these pelicans? What area of the world they live in? San Francisco. Right? You gotta say, wow, what a coincidence. Well, a lot of terrible things going on in San Francisco. Right? So it could be, they just imitated what they saw. Okay, regardless, it comes under, according to the Ramami Panu, comes underneath what? Sexual immorality. So most rabbinic authorities agree with the Rambam. Noahides certainly not allowed to crossbreed animals or graft trees. But there's a question, there are leniencies. Right? In certain cases, there may be leniencies. Now, how do we know which two species are similar or not similar? So according to the Torah, we differ from modern science, how we classify identifying species of plants and animals. We don't really care about science in general, right? But we have a major difference over here. Because according to many scientific taxonomists, dogs, coyotes, wolves, same species, right? They're from the same species. But halacha says no. Halacha definitely says no. So therefore, even though science considers them different species, the same species, we hold they're not. So therefore, can't crossbreed them. Also, the names of the items we determine rather than biological quality, right? Also another major difference. Even though a dog and a wolf may be biologically similar, they have different names, right? One's called a dog, one's called a wolf, right? Pretty simple. Therefore, different species. Also, right, the name itself is only a guideline. It's only a general guideline at best. It does not help determine anything, right? Now, how am I going to determine a leniency over here? In other words, some citrus fruits, let's say, even though they have different names, may be considered one species. Right? So the whole question over here. So if I have a doubt whether two plants or animals are considered the same species, I'll ask you, I'll go to the Orthodox rabbi, right? Whether it is or whether it isn't. Also, we talk about animals that mate, right? That mate in the general way. They mate over here, right? I.e., genital or colloquial coupling, as we would call it, right? You have insects. You have fish. Female, let's say, will deposit her eggs. Male will fertilize them, right? There's no contact between male and female, right? Over here. In any case, this would include all mammals, land and sea, reptiles, both amphibians and birds. So the prohibition also is taking a hybrid species. For example, person shooting a mule with a horse. Right? A mule is an offspring of a horse and a donkey. So I can't mute a hybrid. So I can't mate a hybrid over here. Because the hybrid species is considered a new species itself. It's not considered one of the old things. Right? It's considered a new species. But what about two of the same hybrids? Am I allowed to mate them? Let's say the mothers and fathers, respectively, the same species. For example, a mule's mother is a donkey, father is a horse. To mate with another mule, whose mother is a donkey, and his father is a horse. Now, nothing might come out of it, right? It still might be sterile. But a mule whose mother is a donkey, father is a horse, should not mate with a mule's mother is a horse and father a donkey. Again, different species over here. It's a different thing. So here, what are we talking about? We're talking about a prohibition of mating animals of different species, even if they can't produce viable offspring. Now, this is the case of the mule, right? So you say, well, what's the difference? It can't reproduce. You're right. 100% it can't reproduce. So what? You made a forbidden species. Whether it can reproduce or not doesn't matter. What would I have thought? I would have thought you make this species and it's going to reproduce. That's going to be forbidden. No, even if it doesn't reproduce. Birds cannot crossbreed their own animals or any other one's animals. Right? Even animals that are ownerless, that you claim you can't crossbreed. Right? So in other words, you can't crossbreed your own animals, someone else's animals, or even animals you pick up that are ownerless. Now, what's the prohibition? When does a person transgress over here? So, in order to transgress, person must directly cause the mating to occur. Right? In other words, you place the animals in the mating position, or using means that's going to happen. In other words, you put them in the position, right, to do such a thing. If I put, or let's not say me, let's say somebody puts animals in close proximity one to another. And let's say there's a chance they'll mate or not. That's not direct involvement. Right? That would be okay. I put them in the same pen. Two different animals. Now, could they mate? Maybe. Maybe not. I didn't do it direct. It's indirect. Indirect, I'm not liable. It's okay. But, of course, there's always a but, and that is, you should always avoid placing two animals, different species, in physical proximity. Why? Murphy's Law. Or I would say Murphy-Stein's Law. What is that? That they'll mate. Or they're going to try anyway. You put them in the same area, what do you think is going to happen? Right? Well, for example, a person should not place a male wolf in a pen with a female dog and eat. You don't know what's going to be. Right? You don't want to do that. So also, you don't place a horse in a pen with a mule. It's likely that they're going to mate. Right? If there's a chance that could happen, then we don't do it. Right? Then you don't want to do it over here. So there is a difference of opinion here, whether you're allowed to do it or not. But it would seem to come out that you don't want to take any chances. Right? You don't want to put them in close enough proximity that, it's going to be a problem here. Now, according to many rabbinic authorities, you have artificial insemination. Right? What about artificial insemination? You take one species with the semen of another, that also transgresses. Right? Also transgresses over here. So an animal produced by such procedures, same status. Doesn't matter if they didn't do it themselves. You did it artificially, still forbidden. Right? What about genetic engineering? You manipulate and splice genes. Sounds like a bad sci-fi movie here, right? You splice genes over here. It's also included in this prohibition, right? But this is, a much deeper complicated question, right? And, you got to see what goes on with science and how that all works, right? But also a problem, right? Also a problem, right? Bottom line, you're playing with creation here. You're playing with things. There was a case a number of years ago. Rabbi told me this once, that there are certain species of fish. Now, a fish, what's a kosher fish? Torah says it's going to have scales and fins. You're never going to have a fish, the Torah says, that has scales and not fins, or vice versa. Right? So what happened? So what happened? So some produced a fish. They took a kosher fish. They mated it with a non-kosher fish. And now, what came out of this fish? Fish that had scales and fins. Now, you can tell me, well, if it's got scales and fins, it's kosher. Right? But we say, if it's a non-kosher fish, anything comes out for something non-kosher is not kosher. But it's got kosher symbols, kosher signs, got a major problem. Right? Not to mention, you're making a different species. allowed to get benefit per se, right? Even if I take a peach and a plum, I make a nectarine, I'm allowed to get benefit from it, allowed to eat it, whether a Jew does it or a non-Jew does it, doesn't matter, right? This is a different issue, right? A mule I'm allowed to get benefit from, right? Even though it doesn't reproduce. Can't eat it, obviously, but I get benefit from it. This is a different case because it comes from a DifferentSpecies. It comes from an impure fish, an impure animal over here. So if that's the case, but it's got all the kosher signs, a major problem. Major problem. So the hybrid offspring, as we mentioned, you can keep it, you can maintain it, the owner can maintain it, you're allowed to eat it, right? In case the fish might be a different issue. In all the laws that Rabbi Chaim apply, right? You're not allowed to, cause it pain and make it suffer. Now, last thing over here, what about trees? Right? What about grafting over here? What's called the tree of vine or fruit. So any perennial plant with a trunk or something that, let's say, looks like a trunk is called a tree. Why? Because it gives fruit every year. What are we talking about? Grapes, peaches, apples, blackberries, bananas, right? They're called trees, right? Even though banana, right, the blessing over bananas, double comes from the ground instead of coming from a tree. But a banana, it's a little bit of an anomaly. But in general, a lot of these things called trees. It applies to a combination of trees and fruit-bearing vines. What's a vine? It's a plant that produces leaves and fruit, but doesn't have a trunk. So it doesn't matter whether it gives fruit all year round, year in and year out or not. That would include, what we call vegetables, let's say tomatoes, gourds, cucumbers, these type of things. And a fruit is anything that the fruit or vine yields that we use for sustenance for living creatures. Therefore, a tree or vine produces fruit only animals eat. That's included in the prohibition, right? Even if humans don't eat it, so what? As long as animals eat it, it's enough. However, trees that produce spices, are not. We don't include. Spice is not included over here. So what does it apply? What type of combination is going to apply over here? So first, it's going to apply to a fruit tree grafted to a different species of a fruit tree, or a fruit tree grafted species of a fruit-bearing vine grafted species of a fruit-bearing tree. Now, it is permissible to take a fruit-bearing species, tree or vine, and let's say you graft it to a non-fruit-bearing species. Doesn't give fruit. That I'm allowed to do. Or two different species of fruit-bearing vines. Why? Because I'm not making a new species. Right? I'm not making a new species. So that would be okay for non-Jews. For Noahides. For Jews, still would be forbidden, right? But over here, why would I say it's okay? I didn't do anything. They're fruit-bearing trees, right? So I put them together, not making necessarily a new combination. They both bear fruit, so what's the big deal? For us, for Jews, it would be forbidden. Now, prohibition over here of grafting only applies parts of the plants or vines above the ground. It doesn't apply to roots. In other words, the roots get entangled, this and that's okay. Right? That's going to be okay. Now, what happens? Person, let's say, buys a property, and there are fruit-bearing trees on the property. And first of all, you got to see, are they grafted? Because even though they really belong to you, but now you own them, Doesn't matter who did it before or whatever. You have to see. Many species of trees are grafted, usually. When they're still in the nursery. They're grafted. Peach trees, almost always grafted onto what? Almond stalks. Nectarines, commonly grafted onto peach or plum stalks. Right? They're already done. It's already been done before. Right? So if that's true, then you take it, and you buy this property, and it's got this tree on it, it's got a problem. Right? So what do? If you found a grafted tree or vine on your property, has this graft fused yet or not? If it's been fused, if it's already done, very good, I can keep it. The tree should be watered, pruned, or maintained for its own benefit. Why? Because you got to tell me if it's already been grafted, what's the big deal? The big deal is I'm contributing to the grafting process. That's already if it's been done. If the graft is not yet fused, then I can take it apart. Even, you got to tell me, but it's going to cause the tree to die. So what? Well, I'll have to take it apart over here. That would apply to non-Jews, to Noahides over here. But, in such a case, even if the tree is going to die, doesn't matter. Right? If it hasn't fused yet, I'm allowed to do it. Definitely allowed to do it because I don't want it fused. Now, the other issue is just say, why do that? Let's say, before it's fused, let me uproot it. Let me uproot it, replant it. Right? Somewhere else. Right? So, even before it's fused, I can't do that. I'm not allowed to uproot a fruit-bearing tree. Right? That I'm not allowed to do. But once fused, that's a different issue. Right? So the question is, has it been fused or not? And the last thing over here is, what about the fruit and branches of a hybrid tree? It's already been done. So the fruits of a grafted tree or vine tree combination, you're allowed to eat. You're allowed to eat. Now, there's certain things, if it's been done, sometimes you're allowed to get benefit from it. Sometimes you're not. Depends what it is. Right? It depends what it is. So over here, if a Jew or a non-Jew grafted, took a peach and a plum, put them together, made a nectarine, I can eat it. Right? No prohibition. I don't have to be strict on it. No prohibition. The branches of a hybrid tree, I could recut. I could cut and replant. They're not grafted entities per se. It's a new entity. Right? In other words, it's made into a new entity. A branch that's of a hybrid tree, right? It's already a new thing. But if I take a branch from a grafted tree is like a hybrid animal. It's considered a new species. But there I cannot graft it on either of its parent species. Right? That would be more for stringency. Right? Because even though it's a new species and it comes from two different things, why can't I graft it on one of the other things? Not allowed to. It can only be grafted on identical hybrid. That's the only thing. Right? So these are specific things, and guaranteed. I shouldn't say guaranteed, but I'm going to say it anyway. Guaranteed, anyone who has a garden, right, or has trees, has trees on their property, most likely, if they're fruit-bearing trees, you're going to have an issue. You're going to have an issue depending on what it is. You have to know. Right? You have to know, and you have to know how it applies or it doesn't apply. Right? So, and these are things I guarantee that, Noahides don't know anything about. Clear, they don't know anything about, because they're going to say this shouldn't apply. Why should this apply? What did I do? What's the problem? Right? We see. Goes all the way back to Genesis. Right? I can take things from the same species, not different. Yeah, so any questions on that? Fruit and branches of a hybrid tree, grafting trees, what's called a tree, fruit or a vine, artificial insemination, cross-breeding animals, where it applies, where it doesn't apply. Any questions on any of that? Yeah, you're right. It's always a difficult topic, but no one discusses it. Right? These things I would think are more common than not. Maybe not so much by animals. I don't know. People, generally crossbreed animals, probably not. Right? Probably not. But again, if you're in a zoo, you work in the zoo or different avenues, this could come up. It definitely could come up. But I guarantee non-Jews not aware of it. So certainly Noahides not aware of it. That's an issue. Yeah. So yeah. Anyone have any other questions or general questions? All right, go ahead. Listen, if it's too hard to type, just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Listen, I have mercy. I'm in a good mood today. It's Hanukkah, so it's all the oil from the potato knock is going straight to my brain. Yeah, go ahead.
I appreciate it. I was trying to type this, and yeah, I guess anyway. So I was listening to earlier in the week or last week, I think, and this week, Rabbi Zvi Avner, I think his name is. On Genesis, he has a part on Genesis,
right,
and where it talks about the different ages and how the days in the Torah relate to the ages and how God created creatures and then destroyed them and then created more. And how did he put it? Something like certain creatures, like to the next day, they wouldn't be suitable. Right. There were some creatures that they wouldn't be able to coexist with us. So, God decreed that they weren't to exist. So I like watching a lot of stuff about extinct animals. I find it really fascinating. But then, scientists, the claims they make are just like outlandish. But
I'm shocked. It's a good thing I was sitting down. I might have passed out.
Yeah. But they come up with these things about early humans and early modern humans.
Right.
So the ones they claim that are early humans, that they're not fooling anybody. It just looks like apes. They just look like apes. But I'm curious because I heard a few different things. Early modern humans, when they show their skulls and everything, they do look a lot more like, their skulls look a lot more like ours. Right. And I was curious about that because they also claim that we have like Denisovian, Cro-Magnon, and Neanderthal DNA in our DNA.
Listen, I'll tell you like this. What's the difference between the DNA between a human and a monkey? You know what the difference is? 1%.
Yeah.
It's 1% difference.
Okay.
But no matter what you do with a monkey, no matter how much you train it, it's a monkey. Right? Yeah. And that's what it is. It's never going to be a human. It's never going to be, as intelligent as a human. You have to remember, when the Torah says God breathed in the spirit of gave man the spirit of life. When man has that spirit of life, what distinguishes us from animals? Right? The Aramaic translation, Onkelos says, gave us a ruach memalala. What's a ruach memalala? The ability to speak. Merely means the ability to make decisions. Right? Because the animals can also speak, but I'm not Dr. Doolittle. I can't speak with the animals, but they also speak. We just don't understand them. We don't understand what they say. But animals don't make decisions. Right? They can decide they want to eat, they don't want to eat, but it's all instinct. It's all, programmed DNA. Right? So they want to say, man evolved. Right? But obviously, according to the Torah, that can't be. That can't be. Why? Because there's no such thing. If man is created with the ability to make decisions, okay. There's better decisions, there's worse decisions. A person can do. But even if they have similar DNA, right, that the big question is going to be, and they're never going to believe this, right? So, science can go in Kogel, as my Rebbe would say. They would say, well, come on, that's just the lower form of humans. But guess what? Even if they have similar DNA, even if you want to say that they're, similar to a gorilla or an ape or whatever, they have 90% similar DNA. That doesn't mean they're human, right? And no matter what you do to an ape or a chimpanzee, regardless of what if you ever saw any of the movies, The Planet of the Apes, regardless, they're never going to be human. The famous experiments they did with cats, right? They taught a cat how to walk and to serve and this and that, right? But someone pulls out a mouse, the cat goes after the mouse. Doesn't change. Nature, its nature doesn't change. So no matter what you do with an animal, you're never gonna, that's one of the flaws. Definitely one of the flaws in, in evolution is that, not that to disprove it, but, even with you take monkeys, right? Monkeys are created the day before, right? Day before humans. So if that's true, mathematically speaking, if you read Dr. Schroeder's book, Genesis and the Big Bang, right? If you read his book, according to him, if a monkey had a mutation every second, about 5 million years or something, from the first day, from day 5, day 6, or whatever, it's a huge number, whatever it is. If you had a mutation every second, a monkey never turns into a human. Now, a monkey is 99% similar DNA to a human. 99%. If it's 99%, and with every mutation, you're never going to have a human in 5 million years, you're not going to take a hydrant to a paramecium, make it a creepy crawly thing, and this and that. Right? So whatever they claim, which we don't really care, but whatever they claim over here, who says, those people are human? Even if they have DNA that's similar, they could have DNA that's similar. I get this question a lot. Non-Jews in the process of conversion, right? Many say, well, I took a DNA test. I find out I got, a certain percentage, Jewish. Well, it doesn't, if your mother's Jewish, then you're Jewish, right? On your mother's side, or, you got family that's Jewish and you can show 4 generations, born in a Jewish cemetery. Other than that, DNA doesn't prove anything. Certainly not for conversion. Okay, so they might have Jewish blood. That doesn't tell me anything. That could be on the wrong side also, right? So, it's probably not, not a good example. But the point is, who said, even if they have similar DNA, they can have extremely similar DNA. 99% is similar. They're not human. Totally not human. Regardless of their level of intelligence, regardless how much you train them, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, they're a chimp. And I remember I took a course when I was in college on history and development of science. It was a joke course. That's why I took it. Get out of a science requirement. That's about evolution. So the professor gets up the first day and he says, when you go to the zoo and you're looking at a chimpanzee or a gorilla, you're looking at your cousin in the mirror. So I was like, I don't know who's in your family. I ain't a chimp. I was like, I am not a chimp over here, right? So yeah, we don't hold to that. We definitely don't hold to that. And even if they have similar DNA, so who said they're human? I wanted to make an inference in the Ramban, the Ramban on the Torah, where he talks about where the Torah speaks about breathing in the spirit of life, right? So it seems you might be able to read into it and say, there's a certain time where man, before God breathed in the spirit of man, what was man? I wanted to say maybe that's what it's talking about. It's talking about these type of creatures that weren't really fully human because they didn't have a soul. It's kind of a problem if you say the soul goes in either at the time of conception or at the time when the person's born, but regardless, right? So I got hammered. Rabbi hammered me. And he said, first of all, you can't make such an inference. That's not what it says. I made a major mistake in interpreting it. Fine. But the other question was, why would you try and give credence to something that's not true? Right? In other words, why would you try and find something and say, oh, look, they might be right? Right? But the Gemara already says, humans were, or animals, let's say better. Animals were created, the first animals were created in their full form. Before anything else happened, they were created in their full form. I remember I told this to Dr. Schroeder once. I once took him to speak in Tel Aviv University, to English-speaking students there. And, I mentioned this. So whatever. I gave him the source, et cetera. And he was very happy to hear that. But that knocks out evolution altogether. Because there's no such thing. Animals were created in its full form. So how can there be evolution? You say, oh, but that's what the Talmud says. They say, we believe in it. Okay, that's not the issue. Right? But that's what the Gemara says. Right? So, that knocks that out. And, an Adam was created from what? The dust of the four corners of the earth. How was he created? Right? Full form. Okay. He and Eve had kids. They had kids. So, they grew up however they grew up. But, who says just because they found, these artifacts or whatever, whatever these fossils, whatever they are, who says they're total human? It doesn't mean they're totally human, regardless of what, science may say. Even if you want to say the DNA is similar, okay. DNA can be similar, they may not be human. They could be, high advanced, I don't know, ape or gorilla or who knows what. Someone with a similar DNA, very good, but that doesn't mean they're human. Definitely doesn't mean they're human. That's what I would say. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, along the same line. So I heard somewhere is very vague. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just kind of trying to piece together, but I heard something about before the flood. I heard two different things. One thing was Cain. So with Noah and Naaman, they came from the lines of Abel and Cain. Something about the descendants of one of them were. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm getting a little. I don't want to get too confused with that. Basically, what I'm wondering is, was it possible that any of these creatures or whatever they were, obviously they didn't have neshama like we do,
right?
But is it possible that any of them had been, I don't know, somehow brought about by people? I don't know.
Who are you talking about?
Okay, so I'm talking about these. I'm still thinking about these. I don't want to call them humans, but the creatures that, it looks really convincing when they show them when they show their recreations and their what do you call it, when they show the computer generated images, CGI. And when they make these things, they look a whole lot like people, except there'll be like a small detail, like their forehead slope a different way, or there's a little brow or whatever. But what I was wondering was, I thought I heard something about some of these creatures or whatever being attributed to crossbreeding, people crossbreeding some other.
That's hard to say. I wouldn't say that. I will make one comment. I remember I saw somewhere many years ago that one of the things people hold about to the nth degree is about dinosaurs. Right now, dinosaurs they never found in their full form. I'm not saying they didn't exist per se, but, they found fragments of bones. So they said, based on the fragments of bones, this is what it looked like. It's also speculation. Now, people will say it's not true, and if they did exist in their full form, they got they could have been destroyed by the flood. Very true. Very true. But again, there are issues with that also. They're making them out to be much bigger than they were. And again, if I would say that, people would jump all over it. They'd say, not true. We have this, we have that, we have, all kinds of other identifying things. I don't know. People say a lot of things. Things are, manufactured, to fit someone's agenda. Now, everyone's going to take it at face value. No one's going to question it, right? Who in the science world is going to question it? You ever hear anyone come out and say, no, dinosaurs were huge, they were much smaller, they weren't dinosaurs? Who's going to come out and question it? People say it's conspiracy theory, it's different things, but again, if they're human, they're human. If they're not human, now, why would I say that can't happen? You don't have a crossbreed over here. Why not? Right? Because Rashi says, by Adam, he didn't find a helpmate. Right? Why didn't he find a helpmate? He tried, with all the animals, right? The whole question, what he did with these animals, right? But the question is, okay, he didn't find anything with animals. God created a helpmate for him. What does that lend you to believe? You can't crossbreed with an animal. Not only that, it's forbidden anyway. Torah says it's forbidden, right? Bestiality, totally forbidden. But you don't see that, right? Rashi says clear that didn't happen. So if it didn't happen, if it didn't happen, then it can't happen, right? It's not something that's, that's gonna happen. There is a question you brought up. I'll just throw this out there. There's a question about who Noah married, right? Noah married a woman named Naamah. When I asked my Rebbe this question once, brought down, Naamah was also the wife of the king of the demons, Ashmedai. Right, so it's a whole difference of, it seems like a difference of opinion who exactly she was. I remember I asked him about it once. So I said, so, what does it mean? Was she, she was Noah's wife? She was a wife of the king of the demons? Like, who was she exactly? He goes, exactly. Whatever, different midrashim. They're contradiction. Right? To us, we're going to live with that contradiction. Why? Why are we going to live with that contradiction? Because practically speaking, it doesn't have any ramifications. Zero ramifications. Doesn't mean we're going to try and understand, and answer up, but doesn't have the same authority as what the Talmud says. Right? So, yeah, there's a question. There's a question who exactly she was. Like my Rebbe would say, what, you losing sleep over who she was? She was this one, she was that one. What difference does it make? He's right. It doesn't make any difference. It's an interesting, it's an interesting thing. But you're going to say, well, let's say she was married. She was married to the king of the demons, right? A demon is someone who had a human body. Ate, drank, procreated, died. So that's not a contradiction. He's a human, right? A demon could be a human. Sorry, let's say better. A demon comes in human form, right? We spoke about that in Derech Hashem, right? It's one of the spiritual forces. It's got similar things to do with angels. You can do certain things that angels can do. You can do certain things, with humans, that humans do. Right? That's not crossbreeding, right? He's a human. He's in a human form. Totally, same thing. The Nephilim, these giants or whatever, that were basically angels in human form, right? So, and they got carried away with women, so to speak. They said, oh, we'll never sin. We're never going to go, we're not going to be like humans. God says, watch this. Puts them in human form. They're no different. So how can an angel in human form do what they do? Okay, that's the whole question. Doesn't matter. That's not the point, right? But they were in human form. They did things like humans. So that's not grafting. that's not, that's not crossbreeding, so to speak. So, whatever kids came out from that, we're going to say they're normal humans. We're not going to say they're any less. They're animals. They're this. Certainly not. Certainly not. But whatever, that gets into a much, deeper question about how all these things work and whatever, which, obviously beyond the scope, beyond the scope of this. But, I do hear it's, when it comes to like, these type of things, it's really annoying because, people throw this out there. It's like, oh, see, evolution must be true. See, there's that, but, science is not foolproof. There's a religion called science, right? But most people just throw it out there as like a block. I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm just saying, some people do that and they say, I was once in the States 2.5 weeks, and then one person asked me a serious question, 2.5 weeks. And what was that question? The age of the universe. Okay, ask a legitimate question. But this person wasn't like staying up late at night saying, oh, that's the only thing that's stopping me from being an observant Jew. Far from it. He just threw it out there as a question. Whatever, he's interested in the question. Very good. But that's about it. It was like coffee table talk. That's what it was. Make interesting conversation. Okay. Here's the rabbi. Let me ask him. Let's see if he fidgets. I didn't fidget. Gave whatever answer I gave. Oh, it's so interesting. But it didn't have anything to do with their lives. Right? So people throw out there, they say, oh, look, evolution. You really believe in evolution? You really looked into it? You really thought about it? There are a number of, biggest lies in the world. One of them is Christianity. One of them is evolution. And one of them is the Palestinian people. We're not going to get into politics. Those are the three biggest lies in the world, I would say. My opinion, for what it's worth. 3 biggest lies. Because if you don't believe in evolution, there's never been proof. There'll never be proof. There are a lot of problems with evolution without going into it. But they'll never look into the alternative. What's the alternative? Creation. They'll never look into that alternative. Right? So people will buy that, all of academia will say, of course evolution is true. What, you're going to be square? What, are you going to believe in the Bible? Come on, you got to be square. Why do you believe in the Bible? Well, evolution has been proven. Even the evolutionists say it really has been proven. Oh, we'll find the missing link. Oh, we'll find this. They haven't found it. Remember in the 1990s, there was a Newsweek article. What was the closest thing they found to the missing link? Right? A set of teeth and a jawbone. Very good. I got a bridge in Brooklyn. I can sell you. You want to believe that? Come on. See, cognitive dissonance. If they don't believe in evolution, what choice do they have? They don't have any other choice. The only other choice is that story of Genesis may be true. Creation may be true. That's the alternative. Huge lie. No, people got sucked into it, but today most people aren't thinking in those terms. They're just gonna throw their, oh, you really think the Bible's true? Prove me evolution. Show me that evolution is true. Never been proven. Many scientists have said it's never been proven. A lot of flaws, in many ways. So, it's a joke. Total joke. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Someone that points out science got all the characteristics of all the false religions. Yeah. Yeah. All speculation. A lot of it is. But it's funny in a certain way because they'll swear by it. They'll say it's like truth without any facts. Any facts. Palestinian, same thing. You look at Mark Twain, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, came to Israel in the late 1880s, 1890s. There's nobody here. There was nobody here. We're Palestinian people. Nobody here. Place is flattened like a pancake. Exactly what the prophets say. Is he any lover of Jews? A Jewish sympathizer? He came. He wanted to see the land. Yeah. So where were these people? Where they, they were dispersed. Where were they? Should have been there. time of the Ottomans, time of the what do you call it? The British. Even before, where were they? They weren't there. They didn't exist. We created them, unfortunately. But they didn't exist. There were people from Lebanon, people from Syria, from Egypt, from other places. They didn't have their own entity. Wasn't like they had, they had their own independent power. They had their own schools and their own this. Come on. Didn't exist. They, one of the biggest lies ever in the history of man. They rewrote history. Totally rewrote history. Anyone knows anything about Israeli history? Come on, it's a joke. But they keep perpetuating in the media the same lie over and over and over. That's what they're good at. So eventually, you buy into it. Yeah, you totally buy into it. The whole thing's a joke. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, no other questions. I'm going to sign out. Next week, I guess we'll continue. Otherwise, anyone has any questions, feel free. Shoot me an email. Otherwise, I'm going to sign out. Wish everyone a good middle of the day or almost end of the day for me. And everyone have a great rest of the week.